I used to think the worst thing my husband ever did to me was raise his hand. I was wrong. The worst thing Daniel Cross ever did was make me doubt myself so slowly, so completely, that by the time he finally left marks on my body, I had already been living like a ghost in my own house for years. The morning I filed for emergency custody, I was sitting in a narrow waiting room outside family court, with a bruise fading under my sweater and a folder on my lap thick enough to ruin a man's life. Through the frosted glass, I could hear Daniel laughing with his lawyer like this was going to end the way everything else always had, with him calm, polished, believable, and me looking emotional enough to be dismissed. That was his favorite trick. He never needed to shout first. He never needed to hit first. He only needed to sound reasonable long enough for everyone else to wonder whether I was the problem. I sat there with my fingers wrapped around a paper cup of coffee I hadn't touched, and for a second I saw my reflection in the dark screen of my phone. Pale face, tired eyes, hair tied back too fast. Not broken, but not yet steady either. The old me would have taken one look at that reflection and thought, "Pull yourself together, Lena. Don't make this worse." But there was no making this worse anymore. Worse had already happened. Worse had happened in my kitchen when my 10-year-old son apologized for breathing too loudly while his father was on a call. Worse had happened in my bedroom when Daniel leaned down so close I could smell whiskey on his breath and whispered that if I ever tried to leave, no one would believe me over a man like him. Worse had happened the night I realized I was no longer staying for love, or for hope, or even for fear. I was staying because I had forgotten what it felt like to trust my own mind. My name is Lena Brooks. I'm 40 years old. I restore old photographs for a living. Torn wedding portraits, flood-damaged baby pictures, warped family prints rescued from garages and basements and dead relatives' attics. For years, strangers brought me the pieces of their ruined memories, and I cleaned them, sharpened them, rebuilt them, gave them back something they thought was gone forever. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been my life, because while I was restoring evidence that other people had once been loved, I was going home every night to a man who was erasing me in slow motion. When I met Daniel, I was 28 and tired in the specific way you are when your life almost looks like it's working. My little studio in Boston was surviving, not thriving. I had just moved out of a drafty apartment with 2 roommates into a 1-bedroom over a dry cleaner. I was proud of myself, but it was the private kind of pride no one sees, the kind that lives in rent checks paid on time and cheap takeout eaten alone beside a laptop. I met him at a fundraiser for a neighborhood arts center. He was standing near a table of silent auction items, sleeves rolled up, talking to an older couple in that low, attentive voice that made every word sound thoughtful. He wasn't movie star handsome. He was something harder to resist. He looked competent, safe, like the kind of man who knew where things belonged. He introduced himself first. Daniel Cross, financial advisor, board volunteer. Big smile, firm handshake, the kind of eye contact that makes you feel chosen. He asked what I did, and when I told him, he looked genuinely interested. Not fake interested, not polite. He asked how photo restoration worked. He asked what kinds of damage were hardest to fix. He asked whether I ever felt strange handling other people's grief all day. I remember laughing and saying, "Only when they cry in front of me." He laughed too, but softer, like he was letting me know he understood more than he was saying. For the first 6 months, Daniel was extraordinary at being exactly the man I didn't know I had been waiting for. He remembered details. He brought soup when I got sick. He sent flowers to my studio after the first time he visited because he said the place deserved something alive in it. He fixed the loose cabinet door in my kitchen without making a performance out of it. He listened when I talked. Or at least I thought he listened. That part matters. Because with men like Daniel, the beginning is not a lie exactly. It's a strategy. They watch what softens you, then they become that shape. When I told him I worried my business would never be enough, he said, "You built something with your own hands. Most people never do." When I said I hated depending on anyone, he smiled and said, "Good. Dependency ruins relationships." When I cried the first time I told him how my father left when I was 13, he held me and said, "You won't have to carry everything alone anymore." I believed him. I married him 2 years later in a renovated brick warehouse with white lights and eucalyptus, and too much money spent on tiny desserts no one ate. My mother cried. My friends told me I looked peaceful. Daniel looked at me during the vows like I was the best decision he'd ever made, and I remember thinking, finally. Finally, I get to stop bracing for disappointment. 9 months later, I got pregnant. 13 months later, Noah was born. And somewhere between the baby monitor and the mortgage and the laundry that never ended and the sleep deprivation that made every room feel slightly underwater, Daniel began changing. Not all at once. That would have been easier. It started with tone. He would say things that were almost caring if you didn't listen closely. "You're so overwhelmed lately. You're forgetting a lot. Maybe you're taking on too much. I just don't want you running yourself into the ground." That was the first layer. Concern as criticism. Help as surveillance. Then came the small corrections. I folded towels wrong. I overpaid for groceries. I trusted the wrong people. I answered emails too fast, which made me look desperate. I answered them too slowly, which made me look disorganized. If Noah cried too long, I was too anxious. If I soothed him too quickly, I was coddling him. If the apartment was messy, it proved I couldn't manage my time. If it was spotless, it meant I was neglecting my work. Nothing was ever big enough to call abuse. That was what made it effective. By the time Noah was 3, Daniel handled almost all our finances. That happened gradually, too. He was better with numbers. He worked in wealth management. It made sense for him to handle the investments, then the tax prep, then the household budgeting app, then the business account, just to help. Every change came wrapped in efficiency, in partnership, in relief. If I questioned something, he made me feel childish. "Lena, I do this for a living. You always panic when you see a number out of context. Do you want me to help, or do you want to make everything harder?" I stopped asking. Then I stopped looking. That was one of my biggest mistakes, though at the time it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like trust. It felt like marriage. It felt like adulthood. People from the outside thought we were solid. He was well-dressed, well-spoken, the kind of father who crouched to tie his kid's shoe in public. I was the creative one, the emotional one, the self-employed one who ran on coffee and deadlines and forgot to eat lunch until 4. If anyone had asked, they would have described Daniel as grounding, steady, reliable. I would have used those words myself, at least then. The thing no one tells you about emotional abuse is that it rarely enters your life wearing the face you were taught to fear. It doesn't kick down the door on day 1. It moves in quietly and rearranges your instincts. It teaches you that peace is something you earn by shrinking. It teaches you to measure every sentence before you say it. It teaches you that safety depends on making yourself smaller, softer, easier. By the time the danger becomes visible, your inner compass has already been tampered with. You are no longer asking, "Is this normal?" You are asking, "How do I stop making it worse?" That is why so many people stay. Not because they are weak, because the ground has been tilted beneath them so gradually that standing up straight starts to feel like the reckless thing. By the time Noah started school, the house had become quiet in a way that made my skin hurt. Not peaceful. Not calm, quiet, the kind of quiet where no one slams a door because no one wants to find out what mood he is in, the kind where you know where every footboard creaks and which cabinet closes too loud, the kind where a child begins reading the air before he reads the room. Noah noticed before I admitted he had. Children always do. He stopped singing to himself, stopped leaving toys in the hallway, stopped calling for me from another room unless he really needed me. If Daniel was working from home, Noah would walk differently, lighter, careful, like he was crossing ice. One night when he was 8, he dropped a spoon at dinner. It clattered once against his plate. Daniel didn't even raise his voice. He just looked at him. That was enough. Noah whispered, "Sorry." And I watched my son apologize the way I had been apologizing for years, quickly, instinctively, before anyone even asked him to. That image split something open inside me, because a woman can explain away a lot of pain when it's happening to herself. She can call it stress, miscommunication, a rough patch, personality differences. She can call a bruise clumsiness and a threat anger and a pattern a phase. But when she sees her child learning to disappear inside his own home, the lies stop fitting as neatly. That night, after Daniel went to bed, so Noah stood in the kitchen doorway in dinosaur pajamas that were too short at the wrists and said, "Mom, was Dad mad because I was loud?" I turned off the sink and looked at him. "No, sweetheart." He nodded too fast. "Okay." I crouched down. "Noah, look at me. You didn't do anything wrong." His face crumpled just for a second. Then it smoothed out in that practiced little boy way that broke my heart more than tears would have. "I know." But he didn't know, because children believe the weather in their house is their fault. I put him to bed and sat on the bathroom floor after, hands over my face, trying not to sob hard enough for Daniel to hear. I wish I could tell you that was the night I left. It wasn't. That is another thing people misunderstand. Leaving is not usually one brave decision. It's 100 small decisions made under pressure. It is fear and logistics and money and custody law and trauma and sleep loss and shame and 1,000 practical questions no dramatic speech ever answers. Where do you go? What do you take? Who will believe you? Can he get to the child first? What happens if you're wrong? What happens if you're right? I did not leave that week. I started documenting. At first, it was barely anything. I took a picture of the broken ceramic mug he threw against the sink after saying I always provoked him into these conversations. I took screenshots of bank transfers I didn't recognize. I emailed myself copies of statements from my business account. I made a new cloud folder under a boring name no one would click. Then, one night, Daniel grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave a bruise shaped like a question mark, and I took a picture of that too. After that, I never really stopped. I documented dates, times, tone, location, what started the fight, whether Noah heard it, whether Daniel apologized after or pretended nothing happened. I recorded phone calls when I could. Not many at first, just enough to hear the change in his voice when the mask dropped. Calm to contempt in less than 10 seconds. Sweet to icy. Reasonable to cruel. The first time I listened back to one of those recordings, I almost threw up. Not because it was worse than I remembered, because it was exactly as bad. That matters when you've been gaslit for years. Proof is not just for court. Sometimes proof is for the part of your brain he has been teaching not to trust. I also began doing something else. Something that felt small, but changed me more than any recording did. I started hiding cash. $20 from a grocery run, $40 from a print order paid in cash. $100 from a side restoration job Daniel never asked about because he thought it was beneath him. I folded the bills and tucked them inside an acid-free archival box in my studio beneath stacks of old negatives. A ridiculous place for emergency money. A perfect place, too, because Daniel did not value what he did not understand. I wasn't just making a plan to leave. I was making a plan to survive the part after leaving. That is the part nobody romanticizes. The passwords, the spare keys, the pediatrician records, the school pickup forms, the extra charger hidden in your purse, the copy of the birth certificate at a friend's house, the cheap burner notebook where you write down every account you need to untangle. Survival, when done properly, is not dramatic. It's administrative. About 4 months into documenting, I told my friend Tessa part of the truth. Not everything, just enough. Tessa had known me since college. She had watched me date idiots, fail at taxes, build my business, lose sleep, get married, become a mother, forget to call her back for 2 weeks at a time. She knew my normal. We were sitting in her parked car outside my studio eating stale fries because I hadn't had lunch, and she looked over at me and said, "Lena, are you scared of him?" I opened my mouth and heard myself say, "Not exactly." She didn't argue, she just waited, and because she waited, I started crying. Real crying, ugly crying, the kind that makes your shoulders jerk. She moved my fries out of the way and reached across the console and held my hand until I could breathe. When I finished, she said, "Okay, we're going to make this practical." Not, "Leave him now." Not, "I always hated him." Not, "Are you sure?" Practical. I could have kissed her for that word. She gave me the name of a family attorney who worked with coercive control cases. She gave me the name of a therapist who understood trauma responses. She told me if I ever texted her only the word yellow, she would call me and say there had been an emergency at the studio and I needed to leave the house immediately. She made me type my passwords into a secure note and then made me change half of them while she watched. That was the beginning of me returning to myself, not because I suddenly got brave. Because someone looked at my mess and treated it like a solvable problem. Still, none of that prepared me for the day things turned physical in a way I could no longer soften. It was a Thursday in November. Cold, gray, one of those afternoons when the light disappears before you are ready for it. Noah had a fever and was sleeping on the couch. I was in the kitchen heating soup and answering an email from a museum client when Daniel came home and saw a charge on the credit card for $680. It was for a calibrated monitor I needed for work. I had told him about it the week before. He stood in the kitchen with his coat still on and said, "What the hell is this?" I said, "The monitor I told you I needed." He laughed once. Sharp, humorless. "You mean the monitor you decided to buy after I said we should wait?" "You said maybe next quarter." "I said we should review cash flow. It was for the business, Daniel." He stepped closer. "Everything is for the business when it's something you want." I kept my voice low because Noah was sleeping. "Please don't do this right now." He stared at me. "Don't do what?" "This. Hold you accountable?" I should have stopped. I know that now. But there comes a point when even a frightened person gets tired of speaking in code. I said, "No. Talk to me like I'm stupid." His face changed, not dramatically. That was the worst part. It just emptied. He took one more step, reached past me like he was going for the counter, and instead slammed his palm into the cabinet beside my head so hard the dishes rattled. I flinched. He saw that. And then he smiled. That smile scared me more than yelling ever had. "You see?" he said quietly. "You make everything bigger than it is." I tried to move around him. He grabbed my forearm and squeezed. Hard. I said his name once, just once, not shouted, not even angry, more like disbelief. He leaned in close enough that I could feel his breath against my cheek. "You think you can disrespect me in my own house and then act scared when I react?" That was when Noah appeared in the doorway. He was holding his blanket, face flushed with fever, eyes huge. Daniel let go of me at once and turned like nothing had happened. "Buddy," he said gently, "did we wake you?" I have relived that moment more times than I can count, not because he hurt me, because I watched the switch happen in real time. Cruelty to charm, pressure to concern, monster to father. It was so fast I realized then that he had been rehearsing that transition for years. Noah looked at me. Not Daniel. Me. He was trying to understand which version was real. That night, after Daniel fell asleep, I took pictures of my arm in the bathroom with the door locked. Then I zoomed in until I could see the edges of his fingers. I emailed the photos to myself, then printed them at the studio the next day and put them in a file envelope inside the archival box. That was the first time I thought, he will not stop. Not really. He will pause, adapt, apologize, rephrase. But stop? No. A week later, I met with the attorney Tessa recommended. Her name was Miriam Vale, mid-50s, no-nonsense haircut, flat shoes, a legal pad filled with handwriting so precise it looked mechanical. So on her office had no inspirational artwork, no soft lighting, no bowls of candy trying to make trauma feel inviting. I liked her immediately. She listened for 40 minutes without interrupting except to ask specific questions. Has he threatened your livelihood? Has he threatened custody? Has he ever blocked a doorway? Has he strangled you? Has he ever forced sexual contact after an argument? Has he ever damaged property in front of your child? Did he isolate you financially? Did he access your business accounts? Did he monitor your devices? Each question peeled back something I had been afraid to name. By the end, I was shaking. She slid a box of tissues toward me but didn't tell me to calm down. "Here is what I think," she said. "So, I think your husband has spent years building a version of reality in which he is the stable one, and you are the reactive one. If you leave without preparation, he will use that narrative. If you stay without preparation, this escalates. So the question is not whether you should leave. It's how to leave without handing him the story." That sentence changed my life. Without handing him the story. Until then, I had been thinking like a frightened wife. From that moment on, I started thinking like a witness. For the next 9 months, I built a case. I saved voicemails. I photographed holes punched into doors. I created a timeline of every unexplained transfer out of our shared accounts. I downloaded copies of our tax returns and found numbers that didn't align. I pulled reimbursement records from a community fund Daniel helped manage through one of his boards and noticed recurring payments to a consulting shell that did not seem to exist beyond paper. I didn't know exactly what it meant yet. I only knew secrecy has a pattern, and I had become very good at recognizing damaged edges. Around month 6, I discovered the apartment. That happened by accident, or almost by accident. Daniel told me he had a late client dinner in Cambridge. He came home smelling like expensive soap that wasn't ours. The next day, while looking for a school form on the family tablet, I found a parking receipt tucked into his email from a garage in Back Bay. Same night, wrong neighborhood. A normal marriage might survive a suspicious receipt. Mine could not survive what came after. I followed the trail slowly. A transfer. A utility account, a rental insurance confirmation. An emergency contact name I didn't know. Then finally, after 3 nights of barely sleeping, I found the lease renewal in a folder Daniel thought was buried. The apartment wasn't in his name, it was in hers. Mara Ellison, 29, event consultant. Pretty in that glossy way men like Daniel think means no one will question their self-image. For 10 full minutes after I found the lease, I sat on the floor of my studio and laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was almost boring. Of course there was another woman. Of course a man who needed to be admired in every room had built a second room. But the affair wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the money. Rent from an account tied indirectly to the community fund. Furnishings billed through a vendor connected to one of Daniel's financial clients. Transfers layered enough to look ordinary if you weren't paying attention. He wasn't just cheating. He was using money that wasn't clean to fund the fantasy. The day I figured that out, the ground shifted again. Until then, my story had been private. Painful, yes, but private. Marriage, fear, a child, home. Now it crossed into another world. Fraud, concealment, exposure. For the first time, I understood that if Daniel went down, he might not just lose me. He might lose everything he had built his identity around, and men like him are most dangerous when collapse becomes visible. So I got colder, more careful. I kept smiling at dinner, kept answering texts, kept going to school conferences and holiday parties and pretending we were like everyone else. I hated myself for how good I became at acting normal, but survival often looks like performance before it looks like freedom. Then came the voicemail. If I had to mark the precise moment my fear became certainty, it was that voicemail. I had told Daniel I wanted us to consider a separation. I did not say divorce. I did not accuse him of anything. I said our home wasn't healthy for Noah. I said I was tired. I said maybe space would help us think clearly. He stared at me so long I thought he hadn't heard. Then he smiled in that thin way and said, "You're exhausted. We can talk when you're regulated." He left the room. An hour later, while I was in the studio, my phone buzzed. The voicemail was 42 seconds long. His voice was calm. "Lena, let's be very clear. You do not get to blow up our family because you've been spiraling. So if you embarrass me with this separation nonsense, I will make sure you regret it. You won't keep Noah from me. You won't keep this house. You won't keep your business either once people understand how unstable you've become. So breathe, come home, and stop acting like a victim." I listened to it 6 times. Then I saved it in 3 places. Then I sent it to Miriam. She called me within 4 minutes and said, "We're close." Close to what? I asked. Close to the point where he believes consequences are impossible. I think sometimes the most dangerous people are not the angriest ones. They're the ones who become convinced they are untouchable. A month later, Noah did something that still makes my throat tighten when I think about it. Daniel was in the den on a conference call. I was making toast. Noah came into the kitchen on sock feet and reached for a glass in the cabinet. It slipped from his fingers and hit the counter, not even breaking, just knocking hard enough to make a sound. He froze, not startled, ashamed. Then, before Daniel even emerged from the den, my son whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be loud." I turned around so fast the knife in my hand nearly slipped. "What did you say?" He looked terrified now, not of Daniel, of me asking. I said sorry. For what? His chin trembled. For making noise. Something in my chest cracked so open I thought I might collapse. That afternoon, after I dropped Noah at school, I drove to a domestic violence clinic Miriam had referred me to and walked in without an appointment. A nurse with silver hair and tired eyes took me into an exam room. Ward documented the old bruising on my arm, the tension injuries in my shoulders, the sleep loss, the panic symptoms, the patterns. She did not ask me why I stayed. She asked what my safest next step was. That question saved me. Not why did you stay? What is safest next? Real help begins there. When the nurse finished, she handed me copies of the documentation and said, "You don't need to decide everything today. You only need to stop pretending this isn't happening." I carried those papers out to my car and sat there with the engine off until the windshield fogged. Then I texted Tessa one word. Yellow. She called before the screen went dark. By then, the plan moved quickly. Miriam filed for an emergency hearing. Tessa agreed to keep Noah at her sister's house if needed. I moved money, backed up devices, packed 2 bags, put Noah's inhaler, to school records, favorite stuffed fox, and 3 changes of clothes into the trunk of my car. The night before the hearing, Daniel came home later than usual and tried to kiss me in the kitchen. I stepped back. He looked almost amused. "Still doing this?" I said nothing. He set his keys down. "You know, Lena, one day you're going to realize how much damage your imagination has done." I met his eyes and thought no. One day you're going to realize how much evidence I have. The hearing was on a Tuesday. I dropped Noah at school as if it were any other morning. I kissed his forehead and told him Tessa might pick him up later because I had meetings. He nodded and ran inside with his backpack bouncing. Then I drove downtown with my hands shaking so hard I had to pull over once just to breathe. I thought the worst moment would be seeing Daniel. It wasn't. The worst moment was giving my folder to the clerk, because handing over evidence means admitting, finally and fully, that your private suffering belongs in an official record. There is no going back to minimizing after that. The folder contained the nurse's report, photographs, financial records, screenshots, the voicemail, a timeline, witness notes from Tessa, and a sealed envelope Miriam had prepared with copies of transactions tied to the apartment and the fund. When Daniel arrived, he was wearing a navy suit and a charcoal overcoat and the exact expression he wore at donor events: controlled concern, patient disappointment, the face of a man about to tell the world his wife was confused. He saw me and softened his features just enough for anyone watching to think, "To good husband." "Lena," he said quietly, "you don't have to do this." I looked at him and felt something strange. Not fear, not yet relief. Distance. Like I was finally seeing him from the outside. Miriam stood beside me and said, "You may speak through counsel, Mr. Cross." He gave a little smile. "Counsel?" "Right." He still believed that language belonged to him. Inside the courtroom, everything sounded too loud. Shoes on tile, a folder opening, someone coughing 3 rows back. The judge, a woman in her 60s with clipped silver hair and the kind of face that had no interest in being charmed, began reading before she looked up. Daniel's attorney spoke first. Of course he did. He described Daniel as a committed father and financial provider. He described me as emotionally strained. He said the timing of my claims was suspicious given the marital tensions and potential financial exposure. There it was. The narrative. I had heard versions of it for years. Too emotional, too unstable, too overwhelmed, too reactive. Miriam waited until he finished. Then she stood and walked the judge through the timeline with the steadiness of a surgeon naming organs. Photograph, medical documentation, voicemail, school impact, business interference, financial transfers, separate residence, misuse of managed funds. She did not dramatize. She did not overreach. She let the pattern speak. Then she played the voicemail. Hearing Daniel's voice in that room did something to me I did not expect. It didn't shatter me. It clarified me. Because stripped of the daily context of our marriage, his words sounded exactly like what they were. Threats. Saw reputation coercion, economic intimidation, psychological control, not a misunderstanding, not a bad night, a strategy. Daniel's lawyer objected twice. The judge overruled him twice. Then Miriam placed printed bank records on the table and said, "Your Honor, we are not alleging simply marital misconduct. We are alleging a pattern of coercive control supported by financial concealment and retaliatory intimidation. We are asking for temporary sole decision-making authority, supervised contact only, and immediate protection." Daniel finally stood. "I would like to address the court directly," the judge said, briefly. He turned slightly, not toward the judge first, but toward me. That was pure Daniel. Even then, he thought the real audience was me. He said, "Lena has been under severe stress for a long time. I have tried to support her. Anyone who knows us knows how distorted this is." Distorted. I almost laughed. Then he made his mistake. He said, "She records things out of context. She forgets what actually happened." The judge looked up. "Are you disputing the authenticity of your own voice in the recording, Mr. Cross?" He hesitated. Too long. "No, Your Honor, I'm disputing the interpretation." And there it was, not denial, entitlement. He believed he had the right to define reality even after hearing himself. Miriam requested permission to submit the financial appendix under seal pending referral. The judge reviewed it in silence for what felt like an hour, but could not have been more than 4 minutes. When she finally spoke, the room changed temperature. "Mr. Cross," she said, "I am issuing a temporary protective order effective immediately. Temporary primary custody will remain with Ms. Brooks. Any contact with the minor child will be supervised pending further evaluation. I am also ordering temporary financial restraints and directing that the sealed materials be transmitted to the appropriate authorities for review." Daniel went white. Actually white. For the first time in 12 years, he looked like a man who had reached the edge of his own story and found nothing underneath. He turned to me, voice low. "You planned this." I held his gaze. "No," I said. "You built it. I kept records. If you have never watched a controlling person realize they no longer control the frame, I can tell you what it looks like. It looks small, not powerless, not safe, but small." The hearing ended with logistics, schedules, so orders, dates, procedures. That was almost unbearable in its own way. How ordinary the language of survival can sound after years of extraordinary fear. When I walked out, my knees almost gave under me. Miriam caught my elbow. "Keep moving," she murmured. Practical again. Always practical. Tessa picked Noah up from school. He spent 2 nights with her sister while I changed the locks at the studio apartment I had secretly leased above my workspace 3 weeks earlier. It was tiny. 1 bedroom, a pull-out couch, a bathroom with terrible lighting, and a kitchenette no bigger than a closet. It was heaven. The first night there, Noah asked, "Are we in trouble?" I sat beside him on the couch and said, "No, we're safe." He studied my face in that solemn way children do when they know the answer matters more than the words. Then he nodded and curled against me with his fox tucked under his arm. He fell asleep in 11 minutes. At home with Daniel, he used to take an hour. Sometimes safety announces itself in a child's breathing before it appears anywhere else. The next week was chaos: school forms, emergency contact changes, an intake interview with a child therapist, insurance questions, 100 calls, 2 panic attacks, 3 mornings where I sat on the shower floor because I couldn't remember whether I had washed my hair already. Freedom is not fireworks, at least not at first. At first, it is administrative grief. You are still scared. You are just scared somewhere else. But then the other part started: the exposure. The sealed financial review became an inquiry. The inquiry became interviews. The interviews became headlines in a small enough circle for everyone who mattered to Daniel to know. Community fund irregularities, private apartment, layered transfers, potential fraud. He had always believed image was armor. Watching that image crack in public was not joyous exactly, but it was clarifying. I was not the only one he had lied to. 3 weeks after the hearing, a woman named Elise contacted Miriam. She had dated Daniel years before I met him. Then another woman wrote. Then a third. Not all of them wanted to make statements. One only wanted to tell someone she had not imagined what happened. Another sent copies of emails she had kept for nearly a decade because some part of her knew one day they might matter. The third had taken hush money and spent years hating herself for it. I met 2 of them months later. But even before that, their existence changed me. Because one of the loneliest parts of coercive control is the belief that your suffering is uniquely your fault. Pattern destroys that illusion. Pattern says, no, this wasn't intimacy gone wrong. This was method. There is something chilling about hearing strangers describe the same man using different memories and realizing all of you were once trapped in the same performance. Meanwhile, Daniel violated the order twice. The first time, he sent a message through Noah's old game account. "Miss you, buddy. Tell Mom to stop making this ugly." The second time, he waited across the street from the studio in his car. He never got out. He didn't need to. That was the point. To be seen, to remind me he still existed. I forwarded everything to Miriam. She forwarded everything to the court. Its consequences accumulated. That is another thing abusers count on, that each violation will be treated as separate. Small, annoying, technical, but accumulation tells the real story. Winter turned into spring. The investigation widened. I learned things I wish I never had to know. About shell vendors, about expense layering, about how easy it is for respectable men to use respectable language as camouflage. I also learned things about myself, like the fact that I had started apologizing to baristas when they got my order wrong, like the fact that sudden male laughter from another room made my shoulders lock for a full minute, like the fact that I still, even then, checked my own tone before speaking to people who had never harmed me. Trauma is humbling that way. You leave the danger and discover how much of it followed you out inside your body. Noah changed faster. That was the blessing and the sorrow. Within 2 months, he was louder. He sang in the shower. He left Legos under the couch. He asked for friends to come over. One afternoon, I heard him laughing from the loft over the studio while he and Tessa's nephew built something with cardboard and tape, and I leaned against the work table and cried into my sleeve because the sound was so ordinary and I had forgotten how miraculous ordinary could feel. There were setbacks, too. Nightmares, bedwetting twice. A school drawing where he put himself and me in one corner of the paper and drew Daniel on the far side behind a thick black line. The therapist said it was not unusual. I took that in. Why, the way you take in all things once your private pain becomes part of a system of professionals. Not unusual. It is such a brutal mercy to discover your suffering has a category. By summer, the financial case moved out of rumor and into action. Subpoenas, formal review, board resignations. Daniel's attorney tried to negotiate privately through mine more than once. There were offers, proposals, carefully worded settlements that would have paid well if I agreed to certain boundaries on disclosure and testimony. Miriam read one of them, set it down, and said, "He still thinks this is a pricing issue." I said no to all of it, not because I was noble, because I was done being purchased into silence. The first full evidentiary hearing happened in September, almost a year after the day Noah apologized for making noise. By then, Daniel looked different, less polished, thinner, angry in a way he could no longer sand down completely at the edges. The suit still fit, the face did not. He testified. Watching him testify was like listening to a familiar song played badly by someone who no longer remembered the rhythm. He tried charm, then grievance, then confusion, then concern for me, then wounded fatherhood, then indignation. But performance requires a stable audience. He no longer had one. The records contradicted him. The timeline contradicted him. His own voicemail contradicted him. And perhaps most devastating of all, my face contradicted him. Because I was no longer reacting the way he expected. I was not pleading, not melting, not rushing in to soothe the consequences he had created. I was simply there. It is very hard to control someone who has stopped participating in your version of events. At one point, his attorney asked whether I had ever exaggerated conflict. I said, I minimized it for years. I never exaggerated it. That answer sat in the room like a stone. Later, during a recess, I went into the bathroom and stood in a stall with my hand over my mouth because my entire body started shaking at once. Not from doubt, from release. Fear leaving the body can look a lot like fear entering it. Sometimes the nervous system doesn't know the difference. When the final custody determination came, I did not feel triumph. I felt air. Primary custody to me. Limited supervised contact to Daniel, continued restrictions, financial penalties, ongoing review tied to the separate investigation. Miriam squeezed my shoulder and said, "That's the family side. The rest keeps moving." And it did. The community fund case did not resolve in one cinematic burst. That is not how these things work. It moved through boring language and brutal paperwork. Interviews, forensics, compliance reviews, recommendations, referrals. That boringness was oddly comforting. Real accountability is often unglamorous. By the time formal charges landed, the man I had married as a shining example of certainty had become a cautionary tale in loafers. People asked me later whether it felt good. I never know how to answer. Did it feel good to watch him lose what he used to threaten me with? Yes. Did it give me back the years? No. Did it erase Noah's fear? No. Did it restore the version of me who once thought marriage meant being safe inside your own life? No. But it did something else. It stopped the rewriting. That mattered more than revenge ever could. Several months after the last major hearing, one of the women from Daniel's past came to my studio. Her name was Celia, mid-40s, quiet voice, beautiful posture. She stood among framed restorations and boxes of damaged family albums and looked around like she wasn't sure she belonged there. Then she said, "You're Lena." I nodded. She swallowed. "I just wanted to see your face, to know you were real." I don't think I will ever forget that sentence. To know you were real. Because that is what silence does. It makes survival feel mythical. Like maybe no one has ever made it out clean enough to stand in daylight and still be believed. We sat in the back room on folding chairs and drank awful tea from paper cups. And she told me about the night Daniel shoved her into a dresser and then cried afterward and said he was broken and she'd triggered old wounds and she was the only person who understood him. She told me about taking money to walk away because she thought getting away mattered more than justice. She told me about hating herself for years. When she finished, I said the truest thing I knew. You did what you had to do to survive the version of him you met. She cried. Then I cried. Then we both laughed a little because there is something absurd about finally being honest after years of rehearsed calm. She left an hour later. 2 days after that, another woman emailed. Then another. I did not become their savior. That would be too neat and frankly too flattering, but I did become something I once needed and could not find. Visible. I started using one corner of the studio on Fridays for free restoration work for women rebuilding after leaving violent homes. Lost baby pictures, torn school portraits, water-damaged family snapshots rescued from hasty moves. It began small because I needed it to be small. 3 appointments the first month, 5 the next, then more. A woman would come in carrying a grocery bag full of bent photo frames and say, "I don't even know if these can be fixed." And I would say, "Let's see." That line became my whole life. Let's see. Not everything can be restored. I know that better than most people. Some images are too far gone. Some damage has eaten through the emulsion entirely. Some colors never come back the same, but more can be saved than you'd think if someone handles it carefully enough. I suppose that's what healing turned out to be for me. Not going back, not becoming untouched, learning what could still be recovered. A year after the first hearing, Noah and I moved into a small townhouse with crooked stairs and a patch of yard just big enough for a tomato plant and a folding soccer net. It wasn't grand. It wasn't the kind of place Daniel would have approved of, which probably helped me love it faster. Noah chose blue paint for his room, a loud blue. He slept with the window cracked even in cool weather because he liked hearing the street. The first time he invited 2 boys from school over without asking whether it would be okay, I went into the pantry and cried for a minute where no one could see me. Because that, too, was healing. Permission so complete it becomes unconscious. As for me, I still had bad days. Days when an unanswered text made my stomach drop. Days when a stranger speaking too sharply in line at a store made me forget where I was. Days when I heard Daniel's voice in memory with such clarity I had to sit down. I still apologized too much, still checked exits in unfamiliar rooms, still saved receipts in absurdly organized folders because chaos now felt moral somehow. But the bad days no longer defined the horizon. They became weather. Real weather, not the fake weather of one man's moods. I also began dating again, very slowly, which felt at first like trying to walk on a leg that had healed but did not trust itself. The first decent man who took me to dinner and then asked before touching my hand made me want to cry into the breadbasket. He did nothing extraordinary, that was the point. Decency feels almost supernatural after coercion. I'm not telling you that part to make the ending prettier. I'm telling you because leaving an abusive life is not only about escape, it is about relearning proportion, relearning what is ordinary, relearning that respect should not feel luxurious. People still ask versions of the same question when they hear my story. How did you know when it was time? The truthful answer is not dramatic enough for them. I knew when my son apologized for existing too loudly. I knew when proof began sounding kinder than hope. I knew when practical love from friends and professionals felt more like safety than marriage did. I knew when I realized Daniel did not need my forgiveness. He needed my silence. And those are not the same thing. If there is one thing I wish every person living inside this kind of fear could understand, it is this. You are not weak because it took time. You are not foolish because you adapted. You are not broken because your body learned survival before your mind found language. Some people leave in one sprint. Some leave in pieces. Some leave with hidden cash and copied documents and trembling hands and a child asleep in the back seat. Some leave while still loving parts of the person who harmed them. Some leave only after the threat becomes visible to others. None of that changes the truth. Leaving is leaving. And the first moment of freedom is often not joy. It is accuracy. The first moment is when the lie no longer fits in your mouth. The first moment is when you stop calling intimidation stress and start calling it what it is. The first moment is when you realize the version of you he spent years shrinking is still in there, waiting, furious, exhausted, alive. I know because I met her again. Not in one grand scene, not in court, not in headlines, not even in the moment the judge ruled in my favor. I met her in tiny ways. In the way I signed my own checks, in the way I answered my phone without fear, in the way Noah began laughing from other rooms, in the way silence stopped feeling dangerous, in the way my own name sounded in my head again. Lena, not unstable, not difficult, not too sensitive, not ungrateful. Just Lena. A woman who stayed too long, a woman who learned, a woman who kept records, a woman who left. A woman who built a life again from what remained. And if you are somewhere in the middle of your own story right now, still doubting, E. Still minimizing, still trying to make someone else's cruelty mean something smaller than it is. Then listen to me carefully. You do not need a perfect plan before you admit the truth. You do not need bruises everyone can see before you are allowed to call yourself harmed. You do not need to wait until you stop loving them. You do not need to become fearless. You only need to stop helping them tell the story. That is where freedom begins. Not when they change, not when they understand, not when they apologize the right way, when you stop handing them the narrative. That morning outside family court, before the judge called us in, I sat there with a paper cup of coffee growing cold in my hand and a folder on my lap thick enough to split my life into before and after. Through the frosted glass, I could still hear Daniel laughing. He sounded so sure of himself, so practiced, so certain that this day, like every other day, would bend around him. I remember looking down at the folder and then at my own shaking hands and thinking, no, not this time. Then they opened the door, and I stood up.